Hello, everybody. This is Adam Serwer with Mother Jones, and I'm here with Katherine Mangu-Ward from Reason Magazine.
Hi, Adam. How you doing?
I'm great. How are you doing?
I'm doing quite well.
And we're here to talk today about a bunch of things, but I think we're starting off first with the Romney revealing his human side, as is declared by the mainstream media in several new trend pieces today. So,
That's
Katherine,
right.
why don't you talk about that?
So today is apparently the day that the Romney bot installed some new software and now has a human-like user interface, or at least that's Politico and some other news outlets are running that story today. Weirdly, Romney has decided to humanize himself by telling some stories about pooping in a bucket in France when he was on his mission. So I don't know how well that's going, but I actually do like his spin on it, which is, he wants to tell some stories about his youth and some privations that he experienced, and so he talks about being in France and living in these cold water flats, and then he kind of says, and you know what? It makes me proud to be an American, because in France, I couldn't even take a shower. Which I don't know. I mean, in a way, I like the sort of rah-rah USA and rah-rah modern conveniences. But I wonder why it is that we kind of demand this rite of passage from our wonkier or sort of drier candidates for office. Like, why is it that we think that it's a qualification for the presidency that you have to tell sort of self-deprecating stories in which, you do wacky things as a young man in France or whatever.
I think the New Yorker had like a great piece, like I think it was in 2008, with sort of like the sort of Jacksonian tradition of presidential biographies, which is like almost every president since Jackson has tried to be Jackson, like I came from humble beginnings.
Right.
And, such and such. And this is sort of a version of this story sort of plays out over and over and over again with every presidential election. I just like to point. There's a sort of an amusing paradox in the like Romney bot meme, which is that how many people are really awkward, and it's actually kind of like a human thing to be so awkward that you have a hard time connecting with people, and yet that's like actually presented as evidence that Romney is robotic, when actually that's sort of a really human thing. I just like to point that out.
Right, like if he was like a top of the line robot, surely he would already have mastered like small talk and remembering people's names at cocktail parties and stuff.
Right, like Romney is the world's worst Cylon, because the whole point is that they're supposed to be able to hide among us, not draw attention to their robotness.
Right. And the Romney as Cylon meme is also something that I think, unfortunately, there were not enough viewers of Battlestar Galactica nationwide to really, help that thing take off. But, this idea that there are machines among us that are sort of especially religious and have feelings too, but are also ruthlessly pursuing some kind of secret goal sounds sort of so fantastically Romneyan that I really wish that would get going. And I think it would actually be
Romneyan actually sounds like it's possibly an alien species.
Yeah, I think you're hearing a little Romulan in there, maybe.
There we go.
But I also think that it's a sort of counterbalancing or maybe it's a joke way of working out the ongoing, are we ready for a Mormon president anxiety somehow that, sort of batty Newt Gingrich and other pretenders to the throne are still appealing to the voters, particularly in Iowa and somewhat in New Hampshire, for a lot of reasons, but maybe in part because of this Mormon issue. But what do we make of the rise of Newt face of Romney?
So John Chait refers to this as the Newtoning, which is one of my favorite fake new adjectives.
I like it.
I think it's sort of weird because Newt Gingrich is sort of like the Voltron of like Republican deal breakers. I mean, he literally possesses every single deal breaking quality with the other candidates. So like, if you're worried about personal issues with philandering coming into the campaign, and that's why you don't back Herman Cain anymore, then Newt has that. If you're like frustrated with Perry's quote unquote heartfulness on immigration, his immigration moderation, then, Gingrich has that. If it just infuriates you that Romney supported the individual mandate, well, Gingrich obviously has that. And if, you can't deal with someone who says nutty things like, men like me are the only thing that stands between us and Auschwitz, then, Newt Gingrich has that too, just like Bachmann. And, if you don't like Huntsman because even though he's actually really conservative, he has a way of sometimes coming across like he's contemptuous of conservatives. Well, Newt has that too, and yet he's like emerging as this front runner, even though he has like literally every single quality that has been sort of cited as a deal breaker. For all these other Republican candidates. It's really mystifying.
And if you're sick of business as usual in Washington and want a change,
right.
Newt has that. So he's sort of the consummate Washington insider in so many ways. Even though the kind of stance that he's taken up to now in the primary has been like, "Hey, I'm a loose cannon. Anything could happen."
Right. I mean, in a narrative, when the predominant political narrative in the Republican Party for the past 2 years has been one of insurgency and rebellion. And Newt is about as far from that as you could get. I mean, even though the Democrats are sort of out, the DNC is like out there with the new ad being like, Newt was the original Tea Party. And it's like, well, no. I mean, he is like a greater symbol of the Washington establishment. Washington Republican establishment does not exist almost. I mean, I think you'd have a hard time finding one.
But I actually think the correction you just made there is telling, right? He's Washington Republican establishment, but he is at least in some ways not perceived as kind of straight Washington, right? I mean, he does have this incredibly strong partisan identification, even though he's constantly espousing kind of unorthodox ideas. And the fact that he's spent some time in the think tank wilderness putting out policy papers that contradict each other and, contradict the general party line has weirdly not affected this, I think, incredibly strong feeling that Newt is, for all of his failings, a Republican. Now, I don't know if that does any good, right? I mean, polls show that more and more people are identifying as independents. More and more people are backing away from, down the line party affiliation, at least in their formal responses to pollsters. Although, the sort of second tier of questions in those polls is always, well, in the last 17 elections, who did you vote for? And people say, oh, well, I voted for Republicans in all of them, or I voted for Democrats in all of them. So, kind of our relationship with partisan affiliation as voters is shifting, but I wonder what does it mean that Newt is, for all of his other kind of unorthodoxies and strange sort of ideas that bubble up into the discourse, he is Mr. Republican.
Yeah, I mean, I don't even know what to say. I think he's also the thing that he's got to be the most anti-libertarian candidate. I mean, like, I think that there was during the sort of rise of the Tea Party, there was this sort of embrace of like a lot of libertarian ideas, and Newt is just like a total, there's no problem in surrendering liberty for security Republican. I mean, he's sort of the most, he has no problem with the Patriot Act. In fact, he wants to sort of he sort of wants to repeal all the sort of the moderate 1970s era, church commission changes to producing oversight over the FBI and the CIA. He doesn't think any of those things should exist. One of the most startling things was in the Republican debate when he was we're literally discussing. I think it was like Ron Paul was talking about. If you don't want your government running your healthcare plan, how can you want your government, deciding who to kill, secretly? And Newt was just like, oh, that was done, rule of law, a secret, like literally, we're talking about a literal death panel of national security officials in the Obama administration, deciding that someone's a terrorist and then offing it. And Newt just has no problem with this whatsoever. He doesn't regard it as even sort of disturbing enough to think, we have to think about this and this is very serious, but I think ultimately you have to, no, not at all, just no doubts. He's just a total support. I mean, like, I forget, something he said a while ago about how, like, you have to curtail freedom of speech because we're in a war. I mean, it really is sort of extraordinary.
Yeah. I mean, he is definitely a user and abuser of the, well, hey, you can't shout fire in a crowded theater, so therefore X restriction on speech is perfectly fine. And like a, a nexus search of that phrase in his name, he just drops that all the time in a way that should make people who value free speech nervous, I think. But I mean, Newt is also, he is, and this gets back to our previous point, he is a man of government, right? Like his career is government. And so he sees, government as an instrument of greatness, as an instrument of American greatness, national greatness. And so, when we have, I personally have had like a long running horrified reaction to this whole winning the future concept, which of course Obama used in his last State of the Union speech, and which sort of implies that somehow like China has to lose for us to win. But of course, Newt has been using that phrase for.
That's what his book was called, right?
That's the name of his book, exactly. So he wrote the book on winning the future.
On winning the future.
And there's some convergences between kind of what that looks like to him and others. I actually saw something recently about sort of theorizing that Newt was hypomanic, which is this term that John Gartner has popularized, and it's sort of this idea that you have to have this extra kind of burst of manic energy, to be. You don't have to, but that's one way to be a kind of big, dynamic, important character is to have this kind of manic edge, and it may or may not come with a kind of depressive slump. And I don't know Newt well enough personally to know if he occasionally takes to his bed for weeks on end, but you do get this feeling with Newt, right, that he has these sort of manias, and that he would, use the instrument of the state to sort of live out whatever ideas occur to him during those manias. But I think, we are in this bizarre position now where of the two frontrunners, which, do shift regularly, Romney is the more libertarian candidate in some ways, which is not a phrase that I think you would have expected to say early on in the primaries. And of course we have Ron Paul, who's sort of carrying the standard of actual libertarian positions in the race, and doing pretty well in the polls, which may tell us something.
Well, it's just sort of extraordinary when you think about it. I mean, this is a party that, if nothing else, is sort of united against the Obama administration's signature domestic legislative accomplishment, which is, the Affordable Care Act, and yet you have two Republican frontrunners who have at some point or another rhetorically supported a federal mandate for health insurance in very and done so in very conservative terms. Like if you go back and you look at their Gingrich and Romney's defenses of the mandate, I mean these are very personal responsibility, no freeloading, you have to take care of yourself. They're sort of the kind of rhetorical defenses of the mandate that Democrats aren't really so great making because they don't approach it from the same perspective. But they're sort of on, these guys, both of the Republican frontrunners support the one thing that the Republican Party, as a whole, if they agree on nothing else, are just totally united against.
Yeah, and I think one thing that highlights is just how utterly screwed we are on the healthcare question, right? I mean, the fact that we do have these two Republicans who have defended essentially some variant of the mandate in free market terms basically means that we have no idea what a free market healthcare solution looks like. And, there's been valiant work by many health economists and others trying to answer that question. But the fact is that we're so far from that and have been for so long. And you can see some incremental steps like, allowing insurance to be sold across state lines and stuff like that, which comes up every time and I think would be worthwhile reforms. But at the same time, our healthcare system in this country is so deeply shaped by just a massive government presence that you do wind up with this situation where further, government mandates about how people get and consume health insurance into healthcare can sort of be appealing to people who are trying, and I do believe that both Mitt and Newt, in their own ways, they genuinely are trying to bring market mechanisms into it. They genuinely are trying to figure out, how we can get from here to there, and the fact that they saw these mandates as a way to do it. Whereas I think, the charge at least is that, on the Democratic side, the mandates are seen more as a, step toward a single payer system. Who knows? But
I actually think. I'll just say this. I think the healthcare Obamacare represents I think there's actually no greater symbol of the extent to which liberals have internalized conservative or right-leaning criticisms than the Affordable Care Act. Because if you ask most liberals even today, they'll say, what we kind of wanted was, a national healthcare system, or a lot of people will say that. And they came out with this plan that, was like, it looks a lot like the Republican alternative in the 1990s, and the idea is okay, well, if we can figure out a way to cover everybody and still we fundamentally think, from an ideological perspective, we think the profit motive in healthcare makes it impossible to have a free market healthcare system in which everybody's treated. But if we can figure out a way to treat everybody and preserve, and if the market is preserved along with that, if we have to do that, we'll do it as long as everybody gets covered. But that represents, I think, liberals listening to conservatives and saying, okay, well, a lot of people are freaked out by the idea of eliminating this healthcare insurance market, so we're going to go with this idea that preserves the market, but at the same time has sort of this mechanism for ensuring universal coverage.
And yet I think what you wind up with, and this is so often the case in something that is, at least in some sense, a bipartisan compromise, is something that's actually terrible from both perspectives. And in particular, I think you often end up with something that looks more like corporatism than anything else, right? So,
that's a critique that you hear on both the
on the right
on both the right and the sort of left. There are a lot of liberal critics of the Affordable Care Act who would say the same thing, even though they're coming from a different
right. Well, and it's it's impossible not to see, right? If you just look at what we have now, it's the government telling you have to buy stuff from big companies on on some very, very simple level. And this is the great ongoing discussion of whether or not the government can force you to buy broccoli, which has shown up in various court decisions.
I've told you about my have I told you about my zombie apocalypse theory of the broccoli?
No, tell me about the zombie apocalypse theory of the broccoli.
Okay, so basically the idea is that the mandate is constitutional because it's the only mechanism for dealing with the things like adverse selection and still it's the only way to make the law work. I mean, it's not the only way, but it's a way to make the law work. And the only way you can mandate broccoli or mandate the purchase of broccoli is if there was a zombie apocalypse and you could. And you could, but the virus could be. You could stop the spread of the virus by eating broccoli. Under those sort of circumstances, it would be constitutional to mandate the eating of broccoli. But otherwise, I don't think the individual mandate puts us on the slippery slope to the sort of, great Zune mandate of 2020.
I appreciate your sort of willingness to bring in zombies utterly gratuitously into that
of course.
Scenario, which is, I think, always good for the political discourse, which, we should maybe pause to note the CDC found out a few months back when they issued the official formal guidance for how we should respond to a zombie apocalypse. But, of course, the reason...
It turns out it wouldn't be that bad. It turns out the zombie epidemic would fail.
It would be containable, although there was actually another book that came out, which I now can't remember the name of, but I'll link it in the sidebar, which offered an international relations analysis of what we should do.
Oh, Dan Dresner's
the Dan Dresner book, yeah. And that actually was incredibly pessimistic. That book basically said, if they're slow zombies, then they'll move across borders and then it'll be too late. If they're fast zombies, we won't be able to mobilize and they'll move across borders and it'll be too late. Mm-hmm. It was a sort of a very depressing little read, actually. But to get back to healthcare, I think obviously that analogy is just a public health analogy, right? There is a role for government, and I think even pretty hardcore libertarians say, if something is a highly infectious public health threat, then the government has a clear role. Mm-hmm. Whereas the mechanism whereby the American public is harmed through lack of universal health care is an awful lot more attenuated, and there are an awful lot more possibilities of ways to deal with that situation, as opposed to the broccoli zombie antidote.
Well, that's the right. Well, that's the argument, right? I mean, I think. Well, I will say this. I have there's a UCLA law professor named Adam Winkler who I think has gotten to like the real, really serious issue with this whole question of which the broccoli question gets at, which is if the government can tax you into buying healthcare, what can't the government make you do? And I think that no matter how, and I think a lot of liberals are dismissive of this question, even though I think it's like actually a really important question that they need to be able to answer concisely. And in particular, I think Adam Winkler has made the point that they need to be able to answer it concisely when the Supreme Court asks it. They have to have an answer ready. Because the last time there was a Commerce Clause case that got overturned, and of course the Commerce Clause is this sort of very powerful thing now, much to the chagrin of libertarians. It's this, it can be used to justify just about anything, but it was struck down in that sort of the gun-free school zones case because there was absolutely no link to interstate commerce. And the reason was because the question was asked, like, if you can do this, what can't you do? And that question couldn't be answered. So, I mean, I think it's a very serious question. I definitely think the government needs to answer it. I personally think that it doesn't put us on a slippery slope because there are certain unique aspects of the healthcare market, just like there are unique challenges posed by a zombie apocalypse that can be stopped by consumption of broccoli that, prevent us from rolling down that slippery slope. But I don't think it's a trivial concern.
Well, and, of course, the other place where libertarians have somewhat recently been dismayed about the court's interpretation of the Commerce Clause, I believe, is in Raich v. Gonzalez, right? So we have this issue of drug use and distribution and what happens when that doesn't cross state lines. And the court, despite some movement in the direction of curtailing the Commerce Clause, said, no, it applies here because, and I think what they would say is something similar to what you just said, that drugs here are a unique case and there's a special harm and it's not a slippery slope. But I think the fact that you can always cast these kinds of major policy questions as a special case means that they're all special cases and the slope is actually rather slippery. But then you have, of course, on the other hand, Mitt Romney just saying, oh, it's cool, as long as it's at the state level, it's totally different. I hate Obamacare. It's not the same at all. Right, and I think that's been an interesting thing in this cycle is this sort of sudden resurgence of the 10th Amendment, or this idea somehow that suddenly federalism can kind of get us out of all these tricky problems that show up when, among other things, when governors run for president. And Perry, of course, tried that strategy frequently, not to his benefit if the polls are telling us anything.
Yeah, I think Perry has sort of deeply struggled with his ability to articulate his own views. I think that's Perry's problem. I mean, even the problem, the whole oops thing, I think was just sort of a symbolic of that larger question, which was that, he's written this book where he has these very strongly held beliefs which I think in some ways were, very, very authentically suited to the sort of Tea Party moment, but he is unable to articulate them without making himself look stupid, which I think is probably one of the explanations for his fall, the other one being that he's simply too moderate on immigration.
I think that this idea that, Perry's a bad talker, and that's one of his problems. One thing I've been struck by is that Romney is great at not talking. Right. This is the thing that Romney is fantastic at, and this is not like a big flashy insight or anything. But again, yesterday with this whole $10,000 bet thing, which we should probably talk about a little bit. So Romney bets Perry $10,000 that he can't find this kind of gotcha quote in his book, and probably wasn't the smoothest move ever if you're trying to convince the American public that you're not an out-of-touch rich guy.
Yeah.
But when he was asked follow-up questions about it, he just laughs and says, "That's all I've got." And he's done that very consistently. He's done that with Perry during the debates. When he had the classic "nice try," haha, and then just nothing. And I wonder, where does that leave us when the guy who manages to kind of consistently stay ahead in the race is someone who's just great at not answering questions?
Well, that's been the strategy all along, right? I mean,
right.
That's one of the until Newt. Where now Romney is sort of attacking Newt for being critical of the Ryan plan as right-wing social engineering. Until Newt, Romney had positioned himself so well for the general, it wasn't even funny. I mean, in terms of he had avoided saying anything particularly nutty in order to sort of pander. He had come into this sort of clash with Perry and sort of eviscerated him over him calling Social Security a Ponzi scheme. So he was going to be able to cast himself as the great Republican defender of the welfare state. So when Obama was going to be like, Romney wants to cut your Social Security, he'd be like, actually, Romney stood up for Social Security against Rick Perry, and now it's interesting to watch Romney actually have to move to farther right than he probably intended in the context of the race, just because Newt is giving him such a challenge. And I think what's interesting is that Romney, so the Romney bet moment is the stuff of like political commentators' dreams in terms of like a moment they could talk about for weeks and weeks and weeks that actually isn't all that important or relevant. But I think I don't know if you saw what Newt's response. So today Romney said something along the lines of he called on Newt to give back his money, the money he got from Freddie Mac. And I think Newt's response is something like, Romney should give back all the money he earned firing people and laying them off, which I thought was probably, I'm not sure it's entirely a good idea for a guy who's a Republican frontrunner to be echoing the DNC's attacks on his main rival, but who knows? I mean, I wonder if that's going to turn into as much of a gaffe for Gingrich as the $10,000 bet or has been for Romney, at least in terms of the talk show circuit.
Yeah, I mean, I have to say, my reaction to that line from Newt was like, great. Officially, Republicans are now eating their own young, right? I mean, we've like crossed over, and because Newt knows better. I mean, he's like leave no thought unspoken. This is Newt's, in a way. He's like the anti-Romney from that perspective, right? It's just something occurs to Newt, he writes a white paper about it, reviews a book on it on Amazon, and then like says it on the stage at the next debate. Like he just puts it all out there. Mm-hmm. But this idea that, which I just think is like incredibly economically illiterate, that Romney firing people is evidence that he's like would be a bad president or that he lacks compassion, or I mean, this is what consultants do. Maybe we don't want to consult a former consultant to be our president, but the idea that sometimes companies have to lay people off and that Romney would have been the agent of that should not be an attack on him.
That is the Democratic attack on Romney. That is
right, and I get why Democrats
that is
are
their
going to do
narrative.
that.
That's why it's so extraordinary that Gingrich said that. I mean, from my perspective.
I mean, I get why Democrats are going to do it, but the idea that Republicans would be previewing that argument, that they would be warming up that argument when they are at least ostensibly, theoretically, in some vestigial sense, the party of economic literacy or free markets, is pretty horrifying.
Well, certainly if you're a free marketer, that's not the kind of thing you want to hear.
Yeah. Well, and the idea that that's what the general might look like, I think, is not great, right? That it would wind up being a discussion about job creation, and particularly this idea, which I think is incredibly persistent and ongoing, despite evidence from the stimulus that it wasn't that the government should create jobs, that it's the president's fault if unemployment is high, when in fact, we've spent over $1 trillion trying to create jobs and not done it, really. But the idea that might be what the general is about is, is a little bit...
Okay, so obviously I disagree with you about the effectiveness of government spending on creating jobs in our particular, under our particular economic circumstances. But I will say it's almost impossible to avoid that question just from that's just how people vote. You know what I mean? It's almost like... I don't know that any amount of ideological or economic literacy could sort of change that instinct, which is when people are doing better, they vote for the guy who's still in office, and when they're doing worse, they vote for the other guy. I mean, like, I don't know that it's just sort of, it seems like an almost iron law of politics with certain exceptions relating to, external political factors, like the quality of candidates, the quality of campaigns, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But I mean, this is just sort of, how politics works, right? I mean, when people are doing better, they vote for the guy who's currently in office, and when they're doing worse, they throw the bums out.
That's true, but I think there's a difference between that, right, which is a kind of, it's an after the fact. It's a correlation, right? You can see it when you look at the numbers. Hey, when the economy is bad, when the economy gets thrown out, versus, is the election going to be who can promise the most jobs, or who can most convincingly promise that X dollars will be deployed in X way, and then you'll get a job again, Joe Sixpack. I think that is different.
Do you think there's any way to avoid that conversation given the state of unemployment?
Definitely no way to avoid it, but whether or not it's the primary issue, I wonder. Like, we could easily spend more of the election talking about the healthcare issue, or we could easily spend more of the election talking about the tax burden, or and I would think that given unless unemployment numbers change dramatically in the next few months, in some ways you would think Obama really wouldn't want to talk about that much. But on the other hand, Democrats are more willing to say, although Republicans, of course, are willing to say all the time, oh, well, I'll just spend some money and get you a job. I came up with a new way, and it's really going to work this time. So, and of course, Newt probably has 57 different ideas about ways to create jobs that we could check out.
Well, if I suppose the good thing is if a Republican, but the good news from the perspective of the American job market is that a Republican president comes into office with a new affinity for stimulus. He might actually be able to get that one passed through Congress.
That's true. That's true.
But so I think we have one last topic to talk about, which is the climate talks in Durban, which I'm not quite as well prepared to talk about that as you. So why don't you go ahead and start with that?
Just I think it's easy to for the kind of U.S. population to generally ignore those talks, and in some sense it may be rational ignorance, since at least for the last couple of years, both in Cancun and in Copenhagen, a bunch of negotiators get together. It's this big deal. Everybody races to try and create an agreement, and then at the very last minute, something is cobbled together, which
does nothing.
Basically does nothing, and you have to start over the next year. And the deadlines keep getting pushed back further and further. But what we have in this case is that the Kyoto protocols, which of course the U.S. never signed on to, but other countries did, are expiring. And to me, the interesting thing that's kind of at issue here, and reasons Ron Bailey was in Durban and has been covering the last several climate conferences for us, and it's about who is now responsible for reducing emissions, right? So under the Kyoto protocols and under many of the current proposals, developed countries are treated differently than developing countries. And it's partially a sort of reparations issue, right? You guys did all this emitting, you caused the damage, you have to pay your fair share to undo the damage you've done. But also that they were just, developed countries were by and large bigger emitters. But China is now in the position where they want to say, hey, we're still a developing country and we shouldn't be responsible for paying for, reducing emissions. And, the U.S. and many other players are unwilling to sign onto a deal where China says, no promises, our economy is still growing. Mm-hmm. So I think in some ways it's
and just caught between us are these like little island countries that are literally like, we are falling into the ocean. Please do something.
Please do something about this.
Please do something. We're literally sinking.
And I mean, I think in those cases, there's also this sort of secondary argument going on about how should money to deal with climate change be spent, and there's there's the reduce emissions and hope that we can arrest rising temperatures somewhere way down the line and hold the line at an increase of 2 degrees, which is the kind of baseline right now, or it's like maybe we need to buy those islands a whole bunch of sandbags, which is a flip and ridiculous way of saying it, but actually is a real proposal and one that I'm always surprised doesn't get more attention. It costs a lot of money to emit less carbon dioxide. I mean, it's just incredibly expensive, both in terms of lost economic growth and also actual outlays. And you can build a lot of dams, and you can do a lot of kind of on the ground incremental responses to the, at least at this point, relatively limited effects of climate change with that money, and that actually has been incorporated in the talks. There's this fund which developed countries are supposed to contribute to, and then the money can be distributed to places which are most impacted by climate change. So that actually is happening somewhat.
Well, I mean, just to the point of why Americans don't pay attention to it as much. I mean, there's a substantial and growing portion of the population that actually sort of doesn't believe that climate change is real. So I mean, it's sort of hard. I think if you think climate change is fake, I mean, Durban might as well be having a conference on the tooth fairy or Santa Claus.
They're having an underwater tea party over there.
Right. I mean, what's the point? You know what I mean? I mean, if it's not real, then why would you even pay attention to it?
I think, though, I mean, maybe you know this better than I do. I'm not sure the number of people who don't, quote unquote, believe in global warming is growing. But, after this sort of last round of cap and trade legislation failed in the U.S., my impression, at least among policymakers, is like, we can't deal with this right now. And anyway, we never signed on to that Kyoto thing and nothing really bad happened. So, okay, this is a second tier issue. And that's, that may be different than kind of the attitude of the general American public. But in some ways, I actually think that's, that might be the right response, that at least for now, U.S. emissions per capita are dropping, mostly because we're getting richer, although overall our emissions continue to be quite impressive on the global scheme. But that actually, the fact that the talks keep kind of fetching up on China's shores is appropriate, because China is growing as an emitter, and that's where the action is going to be in the next few years.
Well, I mean, like I said, I'm not the most, climate change isn't my beat, but my understanding is that part of the problem is that the failure to act in fairly short order is going to have fairly disastrous long-term consequences in terms of its effect on rising temperatures. And like that, it's like one thing to say, okay, it to sort of embrace the gridlock and maybe we'll deal with this later, but isn't dealing with it later potentially a really, really dangerous thing for the planet?
Well, to be honest, I mean, I think this is a place where you can either say, listen, the climate change denialists have succeeded in simply kind of muddying the waters on the science. But the fact is that even some of the more kind of upper end mainstream estimates of what the impact of climate change will be over the next, say, 50 years or 100 years aren't that bad. Now, there's absolutely, I think there's like legitimate scientific debate about this. I think most people do concede that, there will be negative effects of warming, but if, for instance, you think that 100 years down the line is awfully hard to see in terms of what the world looks like at all, in terms of our technological levels, in terms of, where people live, in terms of how people live, I think it's not unreasonable to say, yes, in the long run, there may be some pretty major changes to our climate, but also maybe in the long run, we'll have better ways to deal with them than dramatically depressing the U.S. economy now, for instance, or slowing China's growth. Which
that's yeah, I think it just scares. I mean, I think particularly particularly from the sort of national security perspective, I think one of the things that worries me the most is not necessarily just what it does to the planet, but what it does to certain areas of the world that are already unstable and poor and people don't have a whole lot. What happens in those countries when things get worse? I don't know. I'd like to be as optimistic as you are about the idea that humankind does a fairly decent job of thinking its way out of certain catastrophic problems. But the idea that we're going to think our way out of this one sometime, before, I guess the end of the world as we know it happens, sort of just freaks me out. As a strategy.
And of course, this sort of brings us back to famous $10,000 bets, right? I mean,
right.
this is one of the most famous $10,000 bets. Is essentially a sort of an optimistic libertarian Julian Simon betting against Paula Ehrlich, the author of The Population Bomb, and sort of general doomsayer about the ability of the Earth to support more humans. And Julian Simon, of course, is the author of a book called The Ultimate Resource, which basically just says people will figure things out. That's the short summary. And his $10,000 bet was that the price of 5 useful metals would go down over the course of an agreed period, and he won it. And I must say, when I heard Romney, I sort of saw the headline, Romney makes $10,000 bet. For one shining moment, I was like, oh my God, did Romney make the Julian Simon bet with someone publicly? But no. In fact, it was a totally self-serving, nah type debate.
Yeah.
But anyway, I think, that is something that, there's almost like a sort of a dispositional difference about how freaked out you are about climate change in a way. And I wonder if, how that will ever be resolved. But certainly the idea that, a bunch of negotiators are going to get together in another city again next year and have this conversation again with another layer of non-binding agreements having existed for 365 days does not make you feel optimistic that bold, practical action will be taken.
Well, right. I mean, the people on the sinking islands can sort of wave their hands all they want, but unless you have the big countries lining up behind something, it's not going to have any force, any binding force whatsoever. Right,
and like I say, we're at this pretty dramatic impasse right now, where the U.S. is saying not without China, and China is saying not with China, and there we are.
Sorry, go ahead.
No, well, I was just going to sort of reflect back on, when Obama was elected, one of the many groups that were pretty optimistic about, important changes that would happen in the Obama administration were environmentalists. They really thought Obama might throw some diplomatic muscle behind environmental issues, in particular dealing with the global warming issue. And I've been struck just in the coverage of this round and previous rounds during the Obama administration of how sort of total silence from the administration on this stuff. That after the little, and even on the cap and trade push, there really wasn't much. That Obama just has other priorities and hasn't done this, just like he hasn't done a lot of other things that people hoped for.
Yeah, I think that cap and trade, though, is just I feel like cap and trade is almost mandate-ish, and it's liberals embracing sort of a right-leaning solution to a liberal objective. and just like sort of falling flat on their face when it turns out that the people who used to be for it are suddenly not such big fans anymore. I mean, like I think John McCain had a cap and was like backing cap and trade back when he was running, and now it's like you couldn't get 60 votes for it with 59 Democratic senators.
Yeah,
it's just sort of a crazy, it's just another one of those, it's just another one of those situations where it's sort of hard to explain away other than utilizing the forces of reflexive partisanship.
Well, I think the other thing you can say is that, Republicans arguably were doing the same thing before, right? I mean, when Republicans were embracing cap and trade style mechanisms for controlling pollution or controlling other kinds of emissions, I think that was Republicans saying, okay, we get why you think this is a legitimate goal, but if we're going to do it, let's at least do it in a market-friendly way. We get why you Democrats want to, move toward a situation where everyone has some kind of guarantee of coverage, but we really, really don't want nationalized health care, so let's try this mandate thing, right? I mean, I think it's happening in both directions. It's not just that the Democrats are like, hey, here's our good faith offer, and then Republicans are like, psych, now we're moving the goalposts, gotcha. It goes both ways, and it's, perhaps just a kind of a bad luck, timeline where only one side feels compromisey at a time, or maybe it's just that, these compromise solutions are actually not great ones for reasons that we talked about earlier, that they wind up with the kind of no one's happy or a corporatist or a, overly subject to rent-seeking and lobbying type solutions.
Mm-hmm. Well, on that note, I think we're about close to done.
I think we are.
As usual, it's great to talk to you, and I look forward to next time.
Likewise, and
right.
Talk to you later.
All right, thanks a lot. Take care. Bye.